Listen, I mean, you must be your brain must be leaping all over the place when it comes to this last couple of years, because uh, the world of medicine, the world of clinicians, the NHS, I mean, it's not a fully decided narrative, right? I mean, there
No.
are differing views, and you certainly have different views from our first guest, for example, who was also, she's a hospital doctor, and she was very much on the issue of compulsory vaccinations, very much behind that. Your view is slightly different.
It is, and I do spend hours of my day researching COVID, Ian. So I hope that I come at everything with data to back up what I'm going to say.
You're also
And
a
in
doctor,
relation,
which does help things along nicely.
but in relation to your first guest, she actually made a statement which infuriated me, and it came from a doctor. And that was, well, you know, there's precedent for this. Doctors have to have a hepatitis B vaccine. And she's absolutely right. But she's absolutely wrong that it's precedent for this, because we take our jobs before we sign our contract knowing that we are going to have that vaccine. We are not thrown out of our contract and unable to feed our families halfway through when somebody springs it on us. There is data for the hepatitis B vaccine that goes back decades. For the COVID vaccine, we have very little long-term data at the moment. We also know, and this is government data that I can produce, that at least 73 people, many of them young mothers, fathers, have died from having the vaccine. Now, in my mind, that doesn't happen, number one, when we're told to take the hepatitis B. Even if the risk of that happening is 1 in 50 million, Ian, you are then telling people by law that they have to take that risk. And let's face it, it could be them, and then it's 100%.
Yep.
So I have big issue with that. And then the other issue is that we also don't have to have the hepatitis B or the TB vaccine when we become doctors, if we have immunity, and they test our immunity before giving us the vaccine. And therefore, if you're immune, you don't get the vaccine. We now know that actually having had COVID gives you better, longer, broader immunity than the vaccine. So why are we not rolling out antibody tests which are cheap, simple and accurate to all of these workers to show some faith and say, look, we want to protect you. Let's see how protected you are. I have had the COVID vaccine and I've had COVID. So I'm not coming at this from an anti-vax point of view by any means. I'm coming at it from a bodily autonomy and not being forced to take a risk with something. And there are risks to the COVID vaccine. These are in writing, they're undeniable. And that's my major issue. Nobody's answering that. They're just using this, oh, hepatitis B argument. It's not an argument because it's not comparable.
And it's interesting that you mentioned the thing about antibodies, and as far as I'm concerned, one of the reasons why the whole issue around vaccine passports is, it's uncomfortable for many, many reasons, of course. But, the fact that you could show that first you could show that you've tested negative. So there would be that for getting into a venue. And the last time I looked, the fact that you don't have COVID would be a tick. Or you should be able to say, look, I've got the antibodies for this. The idea that we are compelling human beings to only function under the threat of a government jab should be extraordinary and uncomfortable for anybody.
So I think not only should it be extraordinary and uncomfortable for anybody, if they're sitting there in their lounge as a bus driver or a train worker and they think this is not a story that's coming to them soon, they're mistaken. If they succeed with this with the NHS, which I suspect they won't, and I think that's because they know they can't, and that's why they've delayed it till April. More people are going to die over winter than in spring. So if it's that crucial, why are we delaying it till April? And that's because it's just a nudge, number one, but also they will then roll it out to other workers, anyone that comes into contact with a member of the public. And there's no logic behind this, Ian. We know that having the vaccine does not stop you catching it, does not stop you transmitting it. And whilst it does, you are right, it stops you probably from getting infected a little bit. So from that perspective alone, it probably does cut down transmission rates. Once you actually get it when you've had the vaccine, your viral load in your nose is the same as someone who is unvaccinated. So Vince and you were both right earlier, just different takes on the data. But I have studied the data. I do it all day long, Ian, I really do. It drives my other half mad. But this is what I do because I'm fascinated by this. But I'm also fascinated by this obsession from people who are just coming from a Joe Public point of view, probably, and I'm not saying always, probably and often not having read the data, because I know from the answers I get on my Twitter feed all day long, telling me, you know, you can catch COVID 5 times, which is absolute nonsense. That this is not a neutralising vaccine. It's not as good as catching COVID. Therefore, let's antibody test people or let them prove that they're negative. Just telling someone to take a risk, Ian, a risk of dying, however small, is wrong.
And just a final point then, Renee, how many of your fellow doctors share this view?
So there are more than you would imagine, Ian, and I know this because I listen to you often as I'm going on my school run, and I hear you say you'd be hard pushed to find a doctor with these views, but actually there are lots. The problem is that they're scared to speak. And they often email me and say, oh, goodness, thank you for speaking up for me. I'm terrified. And there are actually a lot more than you can imagine, which is probably why all of the Royal Colleges have come out and said, no, do not mandate vaccines.
It's interesting, isn't it? And, you know, even we had the GP, what was the organisation called? The Royal. Yes, that's right. The
Academy of Royal Colleges.
That's the one. Yeah, and various others. I don't know about the British Medical Association, but most of those organisations you're saying aren't in favour of compulsory vaccinations.
They're not. The BMA is not in favour of it, and the Royal College of GPs is not in favour of it.
There you go.
You know, bodily autonomy.
Renee, thank you. It's lovely to have you on.